I've never been much of a detective. I don't have that dramatic flair for uncovering hidden truths like in those crime shows where the guy in a trench coat stares into the distance before dramatically whispering, "Something doesn't add up." Nope, that's not me. I was just a regular guy, happily, or so I thought, living in my suburban kingdom with a mortgage, a grill I was unreasonably proud of, and a wife who was apparently full of surprises. The revelation, when it finally came, wasn't some dramatic moment where I burst into a room, catching Susan in some compromising position. No shadowy figures lurking in dark corners, no cryptic messages left on fogged-up mirrors. It was a lot weirder than that. And, in hindsight, a little too on the nose. See, the thing about Susan was that she was predictable in a way that made life easy. She had her routines, her favorite coffee mug, her habit of always leaving the cap off the toothpaste despite my numerous, deeply emotional speeches on the importance of hygiene and order. And she was terrible at keeping secrets, at least, I thought she was. But I learned something very interesting about my wife on a seemingly normal Tuesday evening. She had untapped potential as a magician. Let me explain. I was in the basement, rummaging through old boxes because I had finally decided that I was going to be the guy who organized his life. You know the type. The kind that has label bins for everything and can locate their high school yearbook in under 5 minutes. It was a new phase for me. I was trying to become optimized. So there I was, knee-deep in dusty old things that time had happily swallowed, when I stumbled upon something I hadn't seen in years, our wedding album. I hadn't been looking for it, and honestly, if you'd asked me before that moment, I would have sworn it was upstairs in the closet next to the winter coats. But here it was. I sat down on an old chair, flipping through the pages, feeling that weird mix of nostalgia and mild disbelief that we were ever that young and that enthusiastic about life. The photos were full of grinning relatives, Susan in her dress, me in my tux, both of us looking like people who truly believed nothing could go wrong. Ah, sweet ignorance. But then, as I turned another page, I noticed something odd. A gap. Not just a missing photo, but a ripped-out page. Now, I may not be a trained investigator, but even I know that when someone removes a page from a wedding album, it's not because they're making room for a grocery list. I ran my fingers over the torn edge, my brain doing that awkward shuffle between "this is weird" and "don't be dramatic." Maybe it just fell out. But then something else caught my eye. A little corner of a photo, half-torn, sticking out from between the pages. I pulled it out carefully, and that's when my stomach did that delightful little drop, like I had just stepped off a curb I didn't see. It was Susan. Susan, at our wedding, laughing, head tilted back. But here's the part that really took the cake. It wasn't at me. It wasn't at some joke I had made, or at one of her friends. No, she was looking at someone else, someone whose face had been methodically removed from the photo with the kind of precision that suggested either deep regret or an overzealous attempt at scrapbooking. Now, at this point, I had two choices. One, I could tell myself a perfectly rational story. Maybe this was some weird accident. Maybe, for reasons beyond my understanding, Susan had decided to edit history and remove someone from the happiest day of our lives. Or two, I could do what every man does when he senses that something is off. I could poke the bear. And, because I have the self-control of a toddler and a room full of unguarded birthday cake, I obviously chose option 2. Later that evening, while Susan was doing whatever mysterious things women do in the bathroom for 30 minutes at a time, I casually, so casually mentioned that I had been organizing the basement and stumbled upon the wedding album. I was expecting a normal response. Maybe an "oh, that's nice," or a "we should look through it together sometime." What I wasn't expecting was for her to freeze in place like I had just announced I was moving to Alaska to become a reindeer farmer. "Oh," she said. And that was it. Just "oh." A normal person might have let it go. Might have assumed she was just distracted. But I am not a normal person. I am a man who had just found a wedding photo that had been mutilated like evidence in a particularly dramatic true crime documentary. So, naturally, I pressed on. "You ever notice that a page is missing?" I asked, keeping my voice light. Susan didn't look at me. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. In the wedding album, one of the pages was torn out, and I found a photo with part of someone missing. Any idea what that's about? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is when I witnessed the worst magic trick of my life. Susan, my lovely, predictable, toothpaste cap neglecting wife, tried to make herself disappear. She suddenly had an urgent need to clean something that didn't need cleaning. She opened and closed the fridge twice without taking anything out. She adjusted a vase that was already perfectly centered. It was fascinating to watch. And in that moment, I knew. I didn't have proof. I didn't have some grand revelation. But I knew. And I also knew something else. Whatever was on that missing page, whatever had been so important that she had torn it out and hoped I'd never notice, was something I needed to find. So, being the mature, responsible adult that I am, I immediately did what any rational man would do in my position. I waited until Susan left for work the next morning. And then I turned our house upside down. Susan left for work at exactly 7:15 a.m. like she always did, because Susan was a person who believed in order and routine. Her car pulled out of the driveway with that same smooth, confident precision she did everything with, like she was the main character of a well-rehearsed play where she had memorized every line, every gesture. Watching her go, I had the distinct feeling that I had been cast in a role I never auditioned for. Once she was gone, I walked back into the house and stood in the middle of the living room, trying to decide where to start. The problem with searching for something when you don't know what you're looking for is that every single object suddenly seems suspicious. That stack of old magazines could be hiding a secret note. That drawer filled with random junk that everyone has? Maybe it wasn't just batteries and expired coupons. That shelf full of books Susan never actually read but kept for aesthetic purposes? Who knew what was behind them? I started with the bookshelf, because if there was one thing I knew about Susan, it was that she liked things to look impressive even if they served no real purpose. Half those books still had that unbroken spine that meant they had never actually been opened. So when I pulled out the one titled Strategic Business Leadership, the ultimate guide to managing your team, I was not expecting it to feel off. It was too light. I opened it, and instead of pages about how to be a successful corporate overlord, I found an empty, hollowed-out space, a hiding spot. And inside? An old flip phone. Now, there are two reasons a person owns a flip phone in the year 2024. Either they are 87 years old and refuse to learn how to use an iPhone, or they have something to hide. Since Susan wasn't a retired veteran living in Florida, I was willing to bet on the latter. I flipped it open. The battery was dead. Because of course it was. Finding the charger was my next problem. I doubted Susan was fool enough to leave it lying around, but she also wasn't exactly a criminal mastermind. I started checking drawers, and after about 20 minutes, I found it buried in the back of the closet, wrapped in an old scarf like some relic from the past. I plugged the phone in and watched the screen light up. There were only two contacts saved. One labeled Work, and the other just S. The message history with Work was empty, which meant the real jackpot was the second contact. I opened the messages, and there it was. S. I miss you. Susan. I miss you too. It's hard pretending everything is normal. S. Soon. I scrolled up. More of the same. No names, no specifics, just enough to make it very clear that Susan had been carrying on some secret relationship. I stared at the screen, feeling a strange sense of calm. It wasn't a shock. Not really. Not after the missing wedding photo, the changes in her behavior. This was just the confirmation. But I wasn't interested in just confirmation. I wanted more. I checked the call log. The last call had been made 2 nights ago, at exactly 11:47 p.m. So while I was in bed, assuming Susan was right next to me scrolling through her usual feed of work gossip and articles about 10 signs you're overwatering your houseplants, she had actually been whispering sweet nothings to her mystery contact. I put the phone down and leaned against the counter, thinking, the smart thing to do would be to wait. Act normal. Pretend I hadn't found anything until I had more. But I wasn't feeling particularly patient. I took the flip phone and slipped it into my pocket. Then I picked up my own phone and did the one thing I knew would get me answers faster than any private investigator. I texted Susan. Me, forgot my wallet at home. You took the car. Need you to leave the office key under the mat. Her response was immediate. Susan. What? I didn't take your car. Your truck is in the driveway. I smirked. Caught. If she was at work like she claimed, how exactly did she know my truck was in the driveway? Me. Thought you left already. This time, the response took longer. Susan. I did. I had to run back home for something real quick. Sure. I bet. I could have kept pushing, but I already had what I needed. She wasn't at work. She had been somewhere else. And the fact that she had panicked at such a simple question told me all I needed to know. I walked out to my truck, grabbed my spare set of keys, and got inside. Then, instead of going to work, I took a different route. One I suspected would lead me to something far more interesting than a day spent answering emails. Susan had always been the kind of person who stuck to patterns. If she was lying about being at work, she was somewhere she thought was safe. And if she was somewhere she thought was safe, it was somewhere familiar. Which meant one thing. I drove toward the one place that had been a problem in our marriage before. Her ex's house. I had never liked Jason. Not in a jealous, possessive way. I wasn't that kind of guy. But in a way that made me instinctively know he was trouble. The kind of guy who never really lets go, even when a relationship is over. The kind who waits, watching from a distance, for the moment when the person he lost is vulnerable again. I pulled up a few houses down and waited. And sure enough, 20 minutes later, Susan's car pulled out of Jason's driveway. I watched her drive past, completely unaware that I had just caught her in the middle of whatever game she was playing. I didn't follow her. Didn't need to. Instead, I pulled out the flip phone again and stared at that contact labeled S. Then I did something I don't think Susan ever expected me to do. I sent a message. Me, we need to talk. And then I waited. I stared at the flip phone in my hand, watching the screen like I was waiting for some grand revelation to appear. I had just sent a message to S, the mysterious contact Susan had been secretly communicating with, and now the only thing left to do was wait. I figured there were 3 possible outcomes. 1. They wouldn't respond, meaning they were suspicious and careful, which would make my life a little harder but not impossible. 2. They'd respond, thinking I was Susan, which would make things very interesting. 3. They'd realize it wasn't Susan texting and panic, which would be the most entertaining option. A few minutes passed. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to toss the phone onto the passenger seat, the screen lit up with a response. S. What's wrong? Not exactly a smoking gun, but it was something. I took a deep breath and thought about how to play this. If I acted too differently from Susan, they might catch on. But if I played it too safe, I might not get anything useful. Me. We need to meet. I can't talk about it over text. I sat back and waited. Another few minutes passed before the next message came through. S. Same place? I grinned. Gotcha. Me. Yeah. What time? S. Usual. 8. No details. No names. Just vague, careful wording, which told me 2 things. They had been meeting regularly, and they were paranoid enough to avoid specifics. I checked the time. It was just after 5 p.m., which gave me a few hours to figure out my next move. I needed to know where this usual place was, and since I wasn't about to ask and blow my cover, I had to work with what I had. And what I had was Susan. I drove home, parked in the driveway, and walked inside like nothing was wrong. Susan was already there, sitting on the couch with her laptop open, pretending to work. She looked up when I walked in. Hey, you're home early. Yeah, I said, dropping my keys onto the table. Slow day. She nodded, her eyes shifting back to her screen a little too quickly. Cool. There it was. That little flicker of discomfort. The kind that happens when someone knows they're hiding something but isn't sure if you know. I had seen that exact expression before, usually when Susan had done something minor, like denting the car or forgetting to pay a bill on time. But this wasn't about a late electricity payment. I sat down across from her. Busy night? Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard for half a second before she forced a casual shrug. Not really. Just the usual. The usual. I almost laughed. She had no idea how much that phrase had just helped me. I leaned back, thinking about grabbing a drink later. Want to come? She smiled, but it was one of those smiles people give when they're trying to hide the fact that they're internally panicking. Oh, I actually have to meet up with Kelly tonight. Of course she did. Kelly, huh? I said, keeping my voice neutral. Haven't seen her in a while. Yeah, she's been busy, Susan said quickly. Work's been crazy for her. Where are you guys meeting? Her hand twitched slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. Just the usual spot. That phrase again. It was almost too easy. Cool, I said. Maybe I'll swing by after my drink. Say hi. If Susan had been holding a glass, she probably would have shattered it in her hand. Oh, we might not be there that long, she said. Kelly has an early meeting tomorrow, so we're just grabbing a quick drink. I nodded slowly. Got it. I stood up, stretched like I had no particular plan in mind, and headed toward the kitchen. Susan watched me out of the corner of her eye, waiting to see if I would push the topic. I didn't, because I didn't have to. By 7:30, she was out the door. I gave her a 10-minute head start before following. I had no idea where she was going, but I had one advantage. Susan had a habit of leaving the house in a rush, and in her haste, she always backed out of the driveway the same way, straight into the side street before heading off. That meant her usual route didn't change much. I tailed her from a safe distance, making sure to keep a few cars between us. She drove for about 20 minutes before pulling into a small, dimly lit parking lot behind a bar I hadn't been to in years. It wasn't a flashy place. The kind of bar people went to when they didn't want to be seen. Susan parked, got out, and walked inside without looking around. That told me she was comfortable there, that this wasn't her first time meeting someone here. I parked across the street and waited. At exactly 8 p.m., another car pulled up. A man stepped out. I didn't recognize him immediately, but when he turned toward the bar entrance, I felt my stomach drop. It was Jason, Susan's ex. Of all the people she could have been sneaking around with, of all the possible secret rendezvous, it had to be him. I watched as he walked inside, barely hesitating, like this was just another normal night for him. I exhaled slowly. So, that was it. Susan hadn't just been lying. She had been lying with Jason. And now that I had my answer, it was time to see what else I could find. I pulled out the flip phone again and typed out another message to S. Me, I'm here. Where are you? I hit send and waited. Inside, Susan and Jason were sitting at a booth in the back, deep in conversation. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed with a response. S. Back booth. You okay? I smiled. Oh yeah. I was more than okay. I sat in my truck, staring at the bar's entrance, rereading the message I had just received. Back booth. You okay? Whoever S. was, Jason, obviously was inside, waiting for a response from who he thought was Susan. Which meant I had two options. Option 1. Walk in there, sit down, and have a nice, long conversation with my wife's secret meetup partner. Option 2. Push this a little further and see how much I could get out of Jason before making my grand entrance. Now, normally, I'm not the kind of guy who plays games. I like direct answers, clear conclusions. But considering Susan had apparently been running her own little side project for God knows how long, I figured she'd appreciate me taking an interest in her hobbies. I typed back, got stuck talking to someone. Start without me. Then I watched. Jason checked his phone almost immediately. He read the message, frowned slightly, then put the phone down and said something to Susan. She nodded, but she looked irritated. I could already picture the conversation happening in that booth. Susan, why are you texting me? I'm right here. Jason, you just said you were running late. Susan, no, I didn't. Jason, realizing something is off. Wait. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed again. S. What? Where are you? I was really starting to enjoy myself. Me. Give me 5 minutes. Don't let her leave. Jason frowned at his phone, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He looked at Susan again, then at the entrance, like he was expecting someone to walk in at any second. Well, I hate to disappoint. I stepped out of the truck, locked it behind me, and made my way inside. The bar was dimly lit, crowded just enough to make it feel alive but not packed. Music played at a volume that made it clear no one came here for conversation. Just the right amount of noise to keep things private. I spotted them immediately. Susan was sitting with her back to me, while Jason was facing the entrance, still gripping his phone like it might explain what was happening. I walked up, slid into the booth right next to my loving wife, and leaned back like I had been invited. Jason froze. Susan turned her head, expecting someone else, then stiffened when she saw me. Oh, I said casually. Hey. Small world. Silence. Jason recovered first, setting his phone down slowly like he was trying not to startle a wild animal. Richard. He cleared his throat. Didn't expect to see you here. No. I said. That's funny. Because I expected exactly this. Susan finally managed to move. What are you doing here? I glanced at her. Grabbing a drink. Maybe catching up with an old friend. Her jaw tightened. Jason looked from me to her, something clicking in his head. You're S, he asked. Bingo, I said, tapping the table. Figured it out all by yourself. Susan paled. Wait, what do you mean? Jason exhaled through his nose and ran a hand down his face. He has your phone. Susan blinked, then whipped around to look at me. Don't bother checking your purse, I said helpfully. It's not there. Her face went through about 5 different expressions before landing on a strained, forced calm. Richard, she started. Nope, I said. Not yet. I have questions first. Jason sat back like he wanted to pretend he wasn't here for this. I ignored him. So, I said, looking at Susan. What's the story here? Let me guess, old friends catching up? She opened her mouth, hesitated, then did what Susan always did when she was cornered. She tried to control the conversation. We should talk about this at home, she said firmly. That's a great idea, I said. But since you decided to have this meeting here, I decided to do the same. Her nostrils flared slightly. Jason stayed silent. Probably the smartest decision he'd made all night. I drummed my fingers on the table. So, you and Jason. How long? Susan folded her arms. That's none of your business. I actually laughed. Oh, that's adorable. See, Susan, my wife sneaking around with her ex is very much my business. Jason cleared his throat. Look, man. Shut up, Jason. He shut up. Susan exhaled. It's not what you think. That's funny, I said. Because what I think is that my wife has been meeting up with her ex behind my back and lying about it. And considering how I got here, I'm feeling pretty confident in that assumption. She had no response to that. Jason, apparently deciding silence was dangerous, tried again. We weren't doing anything, he said quickly. Just talking. Oh, well, I said, placing a hand over my heart. That makes me feel so much better. Here I was, thinking my wife was sneaking around and lying. But no, she was just, what? Reminiscing about old times. Susan's patience was running thin. What do you want, Richard? I leaned forward slightly. I want the truth. And since neither of you seems eager to provide it, I'm going to keep asking until I get it. Jason sighed and rubbed his face. Look, we've been talking for a few months. I tilted my head. Months? Susan glared at him. He avoided eye contact. Interesting. I turned back to her. So, anything you'd like to add? She hesitated, then shook her head. We're just friends. I raised an eyebrow. Friends who have secret meetings, communicate through burner phones, and send vague messages about missing each other? She hesitated just a second too long. Jason shifted uncomfortably. I think I should. I held up a hand. Shut up, Jason. He shut up again. Susan looked at me, eyes sharp now. So what now? That was the real question, wasn't it? I had all the proof I needed. I could take this in any direction I wanted. But first, I wanted to see how far Susan would go. So I smiled, leaned back, and said, Oh, I'm not done yet. Susan exhaled through her nose, trying to keep her composure, but I could tell she was about 2 seconds away from snapping. Jason, on the other hand, looked like he had just realized he'd walked into traffic and was waiting to see if the impact would be immediate or if he'd get to suffer for a few seconds first. Richard, Susan said, voice tight, we're not doing this here. Oh, I love that, I said, leaning back. Because you were totally fine doing this here before I showed up. Her fingers curled into a fist, but she kept her voice controlled. I mean it. Let's go home. Why? I asked. Afraid someone you know will see? Jason cleared his throat, adjusting in his seat. Look, man, Jason, I said, cutting him off. You keep trying to talk like I asked for your input. I promise I didn't. He shut his mouth. Susan rubbed her temples like she had a headache, which was funny, because if anyone had a right to be annoyed, it was me. Fine, she said. You want answers? You found your little phone. You played your little game. What now? I tilted my head. That's a great question. I've been wondering that myself. Because really, what was next? I had proven Susan was sneaking around. I had put Jason in the world's most uncomfortable position, which was a nice bonus. But now, I wanted to see her squirm. So I smiled and said, You first. Susan narrowed her eyes. What? You heard me, I said. Explain. I want to hear it from you. She crossed her arms. I already told you. No, you haven't, I interrupted. You've avoided. You've redirected. But you haven't actually explained anything. Silence. Jason shifted again, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Susan took a slow breath. It's complicated. I let out a sharp laugh. Wow, complicated. Never heard that one before. She glared. It is. You wouldn't understand. Try me, I said. Another long pause. Then, finally, she said, It started a few months ago. I gestured for her to continue. Go on. She hesitated. Jason and I ran into each other. We started talking. I nodded. Right. And naturally, you thought, hey, my husband would love for me to secretly meet my ex behind his back. Her jaw clenched. It wasn't like that. Oh, okay. I said. So, what was it like? Susan hesitated again. Jason sighed. Look, man, I'm sorry. It wasn't supposed to. I turned to him. Jason, I swear, if you apologize one more time, I'm going to start charging you for wasting my time. He shut up. I turned back to Susan. Continue. She shifted in her seat, looking at everything except me. I needed someone to talk to. I raised an eyebrow. So, the only option was Jason? Her eyes flicked to mine for a brief second before looking away. I didn't plan for it to go this way. I smirked. Oh, so it did go somewhere. Silence. And there it was. Jason sank lower in his seat like he was hoping to disappear. Susan's shoulders tensed. That's not what I meant. Oh, no, it's exactly what you meant, I said. You just didn't mean to say it out loud. More silence. Susan's expression was hard to read now, but I could see the panic creeping in around the edges. I leaned in. So, let's make this simple. You can't explain this, because there is no explanation that doesn't make you look bad. Her lips parted like she wanted to argue, but I held up a finger. No, I said, don't bother. Because here's the truth, you chose this. You chose to lie. And now you're upset that I figured it out. Susan's face twitched, and I knew I had hit exactly where it hurt. Jason, clearly tired of being in the middle, cleared his throat. Look, man. I cut him off. Jason, shut up. He shut up. Susan inhaled through her nose. So what now? I sat back. That's what I've been trying to decide. Susan shook her head, like she was about to argue, but I wasn't done. See, Susan, this isn't just about sneaking around, I said. It's about trust. And I'm realizing something very important right now. She watched me cautiously. I smiled. I don't trust you. And just like that, her whole demeanor shifted. She sat up straighter, like I had just hit her with something she hadn't been expecting. Richard. No, I said, standing up. You don't get to explain. Not anymore. I turned to Jason. You? Stay away from my house. You've already done enough. He nodded quickly, not even trying to argue. I looked back at Susan. I'll be home later. And with that, I walked out, leaving her sitting there with Jason, both of them stunned into silence. I walked out of that bar feeling surprisingly light. Maybe because, for the first time in months, I wasn't stuck in the weird fog of suspicion and doubt. I had my answers. Were they terrible answers? Absolutely. But at least now I wasn't some clueless husband sitting at home while his wife pretended she was out having drinks with friends. I got in my truck and sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. All right. So I had successfully cornered Susan and her beloved ex in their little hideaway. I had made them squirm. I had gotten her to admit, without fully admitting, that something had been going on for months. That was all great. But now I was left with the big question. What the hell do I do next? I could go home, sit on the couch, and wait for Susan to show up with some barely rehearsed speech about how it wasn't what it looked like. I could pretend I was open to a calm discussion, let her explain, act like I hadn't already decided exactly where this was going. But that sounded boring. And at this point, after months of watching her sneak around, I felt like I was owed at least a little entertainment. So, I did the only logical thing. I called Mark. Mark had been my best friend since college. He was also the exact opposite of me in every way, loud, reckless, and completely incapable of filtering his thoughts before they came out of his mouth. If I needed someone to talk me out of making bad decisions, Mark was not the guy. But if I wanted to do something mildly ridiculous just to prove a point, Mark was perfect. He answered on the second ring. Tell me you're finally divorcing her. I laughed. Nice to hear from you too. I'm serious, man, Mark said. I've been waiting for this call. I've been practicing my reaction. Hold on, let me do it real quick. No way, dude. She cheated? I'm shocked. There. Now, what's the plan? I sighed. No plan yet. But I figured you'd want to hear how it all went down. Absolutely, Mark said. Give me the short version, though. I have exactly 30 minutes before my girlfriend realizes I told her I'd be home an hour ago. I smirked. Susan's been sneaking around with Jason. There was a brief silence, then Mark burst out laughing. No way. Jason? Oh, that's embarrassing. Tell me about it. So what did you do? Mark asked. Did you hit him with a chair? Throw a drink in his face? Please tell me you at least made him cry a little. I made him very uncomfortable, I said. That's basically the same thing. Not bad, Mark admitted. So, what now? Still figuring that out. Divorce, Mark said immediately. Straight to divorce. No detours. I rubbed my jaw. Yeah, probably. Mark snorted. Probably? Dude, the only thing stopping me from dragging you to a lawyer's office right now is the fact that I don't want to put pants back on. I grinned. Appreciate the restraint. I don't get it, Mark said. You already know she's been lying for months. You confronted her. You made Jason regret every life choice he's ever made. What's left? That was the question, wasn't it? Because logically, Mark was right. Susan had made her choice. She'd spent months sneaking around, covering her tracks, treating me like a fool. There was no version of this where I shouldn't be packing up my things and calling a lawyer. But here's the thing. Susan had spent so long thinking she was getting away with it. She had played her little game, acting like she had everything under control. And now, I wanted to watch her lose. So, I said, I'm not done yet. Mark was quiet for a second, then sighed. Okay, what's the plan? I'm going home, I said. And I'm going to let Susan dig her own grave. Mark whistled. That's cold. She deserves it. Oh, absolutely, Mark agreed. I'm just impressed. You usually take the calm and reasonable route. Yeah, well, I said, starting the truck. She spent months lying to my face. I figure I owe her a little something for that. Mark chuckled. All right, keep me posted. And if you change your mind about the whole calm and calculated thing, I still think throwing a drink in Jason's face would be fun. I'll consider it. I hung up, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove home. Susan wasn't back yet, which was perfect. I had time to set the stage. I went upstairs, grabbed her flip phone, and placed it right in the middle of the kitchen counter. Then I sat down, cracked open a beer, and waited. She walked in 20 minutes later. The second she saw me, her expression tightened. You left. Yup, I said, taking a sip. She glanced at the counter, and her whole body tensed when she saw the phone. I grinned. Welcome home. Susan took a slow breath, like she was reminding herself to not immediately panic. Richard, can we talk? I gestured. Go ahead. She hesitated. Not like this. Like what? I asked. Calm? Rational? Because that's funny. You didn't seem too worried about that when you were sneaking around with Jason. Her jaw tightened. It wasn't. Oh, please don't insult my intelligence, I said. We're way past that. She exhaled sharply. I don't want to fight. Who's fighting? I asked, standing up. I'm just sitting here. You're the one who has to explain yourself. Susan looked at me for a long moment, then at the phone. I waited. Then, finally, she said, I messed up. I raised an eyebrow. Messed up? She swallowed. I should have told you. I crossed my arms. Told me what, exactly? She hesitated. That. I was talking to Jason. I smirked. So, you messed up by not telling me? Not by actually doing anything wrong. Susan shifted her weight. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Right? I said. But it was, wasn't it? Silence. And that was all I needed. Because in the end, Susan wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry she got caught. I sighed and grabbed my keys. Where are you going? She asked quickly. I looked at her. To get some fresh air. And when I come back, we're figuring out what happens next. And just like that, her confidence cracked. Because she knew, no matter what she said next, no matter how many excuses she made, this wasn't something she could talk her way out of. She had already lost. And I was going to enjoy watching her realize it. I closed the door behind me and stood on the porch for a moment, inhaling the night air. Not because I needed fresh air or some dramatic pause, just because I wanted to give Susan a few extra seconds to sit inside and wonder what was coming next. She was probably pacing by now, rehearsing different versions of her speech in her head, trying to decide if she should go for the I made a mistake angle or the you were distant defense. Either way, it wasn't going to work. I walked back in, taking my time, and found her exactly where I expected, standing in the middle of the living room, arms crossed, face set in that careful, controlled expression that she used whenever she wanted to act like she wasn't panicking. Ready to talk? I asked, tossing my keys onto the table. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't ready at all. I sat down on the couch, stretching out like I had all the time in the world. All right, Susan, here's your shot. Explain this to me. She exhaled sharply. Richard, you have to believe me. It wasn't what you think. I laughed. That's amazing. Because what I think is that you were sneaking around with your ex for months while lying straight to my face. But if that's not what happened, please, by all means, tell me what I should believe. She hesitated. I never meant for it to go this far. I leaned back. There it is. The classic, I never meant for it to happen. Susan's expression faltered for half a second, but she powered through. I was confused. No, you were careful, I corrected. You had a whole system. The burner phone. The secret meetings. The fake excuses. That's not confusion, Susan. That's planning. She swallowed hard. I was trying to figure things out. Oh, I bet, I said. And what did you figure out? That Jason is somehow a better option than the husband you've been lying to for months. Her lips pressed together. I don't want Jason. That's the funniest thing you've said all night, I said. Because from where I'm sitting, you definitely wanted him enough to risk everything for him. Silence. Susan clenched her jaw. I don't love him. Fantastic, I said. That doesn't make it better. She looked at me, searching for something, maybe a hint that I was going to let this slide, that I was looking for a way to forgive her. But there was nothing to find. I stood up. I've got nothing left to say, Susan. She stepped forward, panic creeping into her voice. So that's it. I shrugged. What else is there? You made your choices. Now I'm making mine. Her face twisted. We've been together for years. You're just going to throw that away. I stared at her. You threw it away. I'm just cleaning up the mess. Susan inhaled sharply like she wanted to argue, but she knew there was nothing left to say. I grabbed my keys again and headed for the door. Where are you going? She asked quickly. I opened the door, glanced back, and gave her the truth. Somewhere that isn't here. Then I walked out. And this time, I didn't look back. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel